Hi, I'm Lisa Kudrow. I'm glad you're here today. Mental health care and education is important to me. That's why I chose to become involved at UCLA, joining the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors and emceeing the galas and hashtag WOW, the Wonder of Women Summit. I'm so excited that WOW and UCLA's Friends of Semel Institute Open Mind have joined together to bring outstanding, free virtual programs about mental health issues. This means you will hear conversations on the intersection of culture and science between renowned authors and filmmakers who share their personal stories and world-class UCLA scientists that highlight the latest in mental health research, care, and progress. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Open Mind WOW series and hope to see you at many more programs.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA, the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, and WOW, the Wonder of Women, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first Open Mind of 2021. And I can't think of a better way to kick off the season and the new year than by welcoming back for his third appearance, Rabbi Steve Leder, Senior Rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple and the author of 4 books, including the best-selling book, More Beautiful Than Before, which he spoke about at an Open Mind in December 2018, and his new book that he is here to talk about today, The Beauty of What Remains, How Our Greatest Fear Becomes Our Greatest Gift. We are honored to have Rabbi Leder here with us today to share his words of wisdom about grief and loss, what they can reveal and teach us, especially at this challenging time when most of us have experienced some type of loss, and to help us recognize the deepest truth and beauty in the deepest truth and meaning in the beauty of what remains. We are also honored to welcome back to the Open Mind, I believe also his third appearance, Dr. David Reuben, Director of the Multi-Campus Program in Geriatrics Medicine and Gerontology, and the founder and director of the UCLA Alzheimer's and Dementia Care Program. Dr. Reuben will join Rabbi Leder in what promises to be a meaningful and inspiring dialogue between a rabbi and a doctor, 2 wise scholars who regularly help people deal with end-of-life issues from their unique perspectives and professions. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program is being taped, so if your friends, colleagues, or family were not able to join us today, or if you just want to refer back to the video, it will be found on the Friends of Semel website tomorrow. And there you will also find our library of past Open Mind videos and a calendar of our upcoming events. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, and it will include time for your questions in the very last segment of the program. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. And lastly, we want to thank all of you who supported our year-end giving campaign. It is thanks to your generosity that we are able to continue to bring our Open Mind programs to the public at no charge, support research through our Friends Scholar program that awards grants to early career neuroscientists, and now also sponsor the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students. You can read more about all of these programs on our website, friendsofsemel.org. And now please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Rabbi Steve Leder and Dr. David Reuben. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vicki. Thanks for having us here this evening. I'm going to start off, first of all, by saying a couple words about Rabbi Leder's book. I have to make a confession. I generally don't read books about death and dying. My feeling is that I gave it the office, and I get a lot of exposure to this. But it appeared in my mail a few weeks ago, and I read it entirely. And by the end of the book, I really felt like I knew the author and I liked him. I felt that a lot of the values that that Rabbi Leder and I had expressed, I truly share and feel very similarly. So it was really a pleasure. I also want to say there's a lot of wisdom in this book. Between the covers of this book, there are a lot of experiences, a lot of things that we all share, and a lot to be learned from it. So I have to ask Steve, and we agreed to use first names here. I have to ask Steve, why this book and why now?
Those are related. First of all, thank you so much, Dave, for doing this, and thank you everyone who's attending today, and thank you to Vicki and Wendy as well. Why this book? Why now? Well, obviously, I started this book 2 years ago and had no idea it would land in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century, when we would all be suffering and struggling with loss, not just the loss of life, but loss of so many things. We've lost our sense of invulnerability. We've lost our freedom. We've lost, a lot of us have lost jobs and money and security. I have an 87-year-old mother in Minneapolis that I haven't been able to hug for a year. We've lost even the basic human right to hold and be held. So we're all struggling with loss. And it almost feels as if I wrote the book for the pandemic, but I didn't. It just happened to land during the pandemic. I started it 2 years ago. Why? I've been a rabbi for 30 years before my father died. And my father had a 10-year journey with Alzheimer's, something you know well. And then eventually he died about 3 years ago. And I'd been a rabbi for 30 years before my father died. And I had helped, and this is not rabbinic hyperbole, I had helped literally more than 1,000 families over that period through this journey that we call death and loss and grief and mourning. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job. I would have given myself an A-. And then my father died. And what I realized, which I say in the prologue, is that much of what I had been teaching and saying and doing to help people through this journey that we all have to take was just 1 degree shy of the deepest truth. And so I wrote this book to hopefully bring us all to that 1 degree deeper in terms of revealing everything that death comes to teach us about living, a meaningful and beautiful life, which is, of course, my real goal. And I've come to the conclusion over the years that death is the only teacher. So the book is, in a sense, a kind of setting the record straight, a kind of an apology. And it weaves together my journey with my father and the journey from Rabbi Steve Leder to the son, Steve Leder, and a kind of field guide for people who, when they are in what you and I have seen so many times, the fog of death for those who are alive, this surreal fog that we're all in when a loved one dies. I wrote this as a kind of field guide that people would read once like you did, but then keep on the shelf and then pick up again when the time comes and it's really needed. So, but really it's a setting the record straight, an attempt to go as deep as I am capable now of going, combining the experience of a rabbi of one of the world's largest congregations and 33 years of being in the, inside of people's lives and deaths, and the experience of a son who buried his father. So that's really why and why now. I will say Penguin Random House made the decision to move the release date up from March to January. That was their call. They felt the pandemic, that there wasn't much out there in helping people navigate, and they made the decision to move the date up. It was originally supposed to be released in March. I think they made the right call.
So We actually, just for the audience's sake, we had a preliminary discussion, and we talked before tonight's call about kind of our approach to working with people who are dying and working with families of people who are dying. In many respects, the people are not any different. They're the same people, but we are wearing different uniforms. And I'm going to have Steve say a little bit about your perspective coming at this from the spiritual, religious, and rabbinical side, and how you approach it. And then I'll say a little bit about from the medical side.
Yeah, I'm far more interested in your answer than mine, by the way, because it's fascinating to me. Look, I come as two things, and this is sometimes a dichotomous tension that's very difficult to resolve when I'm working with a family. I come to a family as a rabbi who, has studied and not fully, but sufficiently understands Jewish law when it comes to death and dying and mourning and grief. I come from a tradition that has prescribed rituals and behaviors to help serve as a kind of vessel to hold us as we journey through this thing we call death and grief and mourning. So I would imagine that that's very similar to you, Dave, in some ways, that there are protocols. There are things coming from our backgrounds, this is how we do it. This is what we do. This is our time-tested wisdom. Now, that being said, I'm very close with a surgeon. We play chess together pretty frequently. And he's in his 70s, so he's been a surgeon for a long time. And he said to me, I said, what's the difference between you and the young surgeons coming out of medical school now? And he said, well, they know the rules, and I know the exceptions to the rules. So I think that's the other more nuanced answer to your question, is that there are times when I think it's appropriate to diverge from those protocols, to amend those protocols, or sometimes even to ignore them or supersede them for other compelling reasons. And I think that that's where things turn from science to art, and where one has to really be able to dial into the nuances of the human condition. And there's a chapter in the book, if I can, I don't know if you want me to tell the story now, but it seems like a good answer to your question. So forgive me for a little bit of a lengthy story now. There's a book in chapter 4. There's a story in chapter 4 in the book, which is about a woman named Tara who had ALS. And she told her husband, whose name was Stephen, when the time comes and I give you the signal, I want you to call Rabbi Leder, and I want him to come over and give me permission to take the medication to end my life. And I'm driving home from a clergy retreat in the desert in horrible traffic on the 10, and the phone rings, and it's Stephen. And he said, Tara asked me to call you. She wants to take the end of life medication, but she won't do it unless you give her permission. Please come now. So it took me a couple hours. I got to their house. I walked into her bedroom, and she had completely lost the ability to speak. And she had lost also, about a day before, the ability to point to letters on a chart in order to spell short and simple words. So she really could only communicate with me with her eyes, and barely such. Now, Jewish law is categorically opposed to active euthanasia. There is no ambiguity. It is murder, no matter how compromised the person's life may be, and no matter how close to death. Jewish law is categorically opposed to active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is allowed, but not active euthanasia. I know this walking into her room. And then I see her in her entire world, which has shrunk to the size of a rented hospital bed. And she is really suffering and really gasping for air. I don't know how it affects you, Dave, but for me, oxygen deprivation seems to be it's the most difficult thing for me to witness in a dying person. And Stephen looked at me and said, Rabbi, she wants to end her life, but she won't do it unless you say she can. Yes or no? This was not going to be a nuanced conversation. And I looked at her, and then I asked her daughter and her husband to step out into the hallway with me. And I said to them, Jewish law absolutely forbids Tara to take the medication, to take the drugs. But I'm going to walk back in there and tell her she should, because I cannot live with myself if I am going to be more compassionate with my dog than a human being. And so I walked back into the room and I looked at Tara and I said, Tara, you should take the medication. You should take the drugs. It's okay. It's the right thing to do. And she closed her eyes and I left. And 2 hours later, the phone rang at home. It was her husband, Stephen. And he said, Rabbi Leder, Tara's gone. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so much for giving her permission to end her suffering. And as I say in the book, Stephen was calling Rabbi Leder, but it was Steve Leder who picked up the phone. And this is one of those times where the man and the rabbi just couldn't be the same person. This was one of those exceptions where I could give Jewish tradition and law a vote, but I couldn't give it a veto. And that's what I did. And this chapter, by the way, is already causing, plenty of controversy in the Jewish world. How dare he? How could any rabbi this? How could any rabbi that? But this was one of those rare times where my humanity was not in line. It wasn't aligned with my discipline, with my science, with my profession, so to speak. And I just did what I felt was the humane thing to do. So let me turn the table on you. Have you found yourself in similar circumstances? Because you're dealing with end of life and families looking at you asking, doctor, what do I do? Probably more than I am.
So what you're describing, they have a psychological term, role strain.
Yes.
It's a strain between Steve as the rabbi and Steve as the person. And I would say, as a physician, there's less of that role strain. If anything, our job is a bit easier from that perspective, maybe from that perspective alone. I would say in medicine, we have a rather formulaic approach that allows deviation. Mm-hmm. So everybody has a story, and everybody's death is a story. A friend of mine who was an oncologist when I was in training, he was an Indian oncologist, and he was very spiritual. He said, you only die once, and how you die, you have a lot of say in it. So when we approach it, and you see these situations all the time, each person has an individual situation. And that situation, like any story, has a background to it. What is this person's overall health conditions? What are the acute illnesses that we are dealing with? What is the prognosis? How likely is someone to recover? And what's the journey going to be like? Mm-hmm. So I'll tell a story as well about a patient of mine who was 103 years old. And she was a charmed life. She was married to a Hollywood director, a kind of a household name Hollywood director in the 1930s, and she had a lot of frailty towards the end. She had lost some of her cognition. She became much more frail. And at 103 years old, I think it was either the anniversary of her death or of her husband's of her marriage, or very close. She went to the bathroom. Her caregiver said she was ashen. They took her to the hospital, and it looked like she had very large blood clots to her lungs, pulmonary emboli. And I got her son on the phone, and the way I described it to him, I said, it's possible that she could get through this with a breathing machine and being intubated and such, but the journey back would be extremely long, extremely difficult, with lots of setbacks, and she may not make it.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, he knew that she didn't want that journey.
Yeah.
And then again, I didn't have to answer to any kind of religious doctrine.
Right.
I could frame it in the secular, and to say, both of these professions have incredible intimacy with patients and family members at the time of death.
Yeah.
There is no more intimate moment.
Yes.
But we do approach it just a little differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Lucky you.
Yes,
Yeah, lucky you. But ideally we want to be aligned, but because we're talking about the human condition and the human journey, it's very nuanced. And I always remember what my surgeon friend said, is that, it's one thing to know the rules, it's another to know the exceptions to the rules. That's, I think, a higher art form, really. And it again speaks to why I wrote the book, because I've learned a few things over the years. The book opens with the story of my first funeral, and I was 27 years old, only 2 years older than the young man I was burying, who died of AIDS-related illness. And I could only imagine what his parents thought when a 27-year-old kid walked into their home to guide them through this horrific situation. And I'm a completely different kind of rabbi now than I was then. And I think it's to the benefit of the people that I'm engaged with and trying to help on these journeys, without a doubt.
One of the things I was very struck with, and reading the book, I particularly liked, and also considered a lot of the differences between medicine and religious approaches to this, is that before death, we as physicians are incredibly involved, hour to hour, day to, minute to minute, etc. And then once somebody passes, we step out of the limelight and there's a number of things that I attend a lot of my patients' funerals. And I've spoken in a few, but rarely. And I always send a condolence card and give a call if it's an unexpected death. But some of the things that I thought were among the most moving in the book was kind of how you deal with the families between death and the burial, essentially.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, because I step out to some degree before the death occurs. So many times people call me and say, Steve, my father's just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He's got 3 to 6 months, and we'd like to get together with you to talk about his funeral. And I always say no, because I don't want to see people miss the end of their loved one's life worrying about and choreographing and producing and planning their death. And so I actually try to keep people in your court on the front end, the way you kind of step away on the back end. Look, for a rabbi, and especially a rabbi like me, who has been at the same congregation for more than 33 years, I am intimately involved with families for years after the death, because, Judaism structures these landing places or these vessels to contain and manage grief for as long as we live after our loved ones die. There are 5 times a year when you light a memorial candle, a yahrzeit candle, for example. We read the name before we say the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, every year on the anniversary of the person's death. We have a memorial wall in the sanctuary where we put up people's names. We do unveiling ceremonies a year later. And I call people 7 days after, 30 days after, because, and again, this goes to why I think the book, I know it sounds self-serving, but I honestly believe it's so important, because there is so much to learn from death after our loved ones have died. So much to learn about the power and the beauty and the profundity of memory, about the duality of memory, about legacy, about ennobling our own lives, because life is finite and fleeting, but that's a hard lesson to learn until you encounter death, and then what? And I deal so often with elderly people whose spouses have died who just don't see a way forward. They just don't see a way forward. And my mission is to give them hope and to give them structure and grief support and to connect them to community again. So really most of the, if I could put it in an hourly kind of way, most of the time, the hours happen after a person has died, not before. And because I think that so much of death is really about how we're going to enable it to inform the lives of the living in its aftermath. That's what it's about. That's where the game is won or lost. If you're going to go through hell, you don't want to come out empty-handed. You want your life to be a better, more beautiful life going forward. So I think it's an astute observation on your part. And by the way, since we're talking professional to professional in a way and kind of the dark underbelly of it all, this causes tremendous anxiety for me, because I never know if it's enough. Am I calling this family enough? Am I engaged enough? Am I helping enough? Because at some point, and at this point now, partly because of COVID and partly just because it's such a large congregation, I'm doing 3, 4, sometimes 5 funerals a week. And it creates, I'm always worried I'm disappointing someone on the back end, that I haven't called enough or remembered enough. Oh, it's your anniversary. Oh, it's your birthday. Oh, it's been a month. Oh, it's been 6 months. So, I'm in, maybe this is a Jewish thing, I don't know, but I'm in constant worry that I'm not doing a good enough job and I'm disappointing people. And you just have to learn to live with that, but it's not pleasant.
So we're going to explore this a little bit more in just a moment. But as you were saying about this, about afterwards, after people pass, it made me think of something. In our electronic health record, we have our patient lists.
Mm.
It's supposed to be a tool to help us find patients quicker and this and that as we go through. And I have this patient list of, probably 600-700 people. And probably 2/3 of them have passed.
Mm.
And it would really clean up my list to remove them. But I haven't been able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when I go to my patient list, I frequently review it, and it makes me think about these people that I've cared for, and just remembering them, and remembering who loved them, remembering their families. It's very gratifying. It's very
well. Is in the since we're being so honest about all of this today, I have the opposite experience. I did not write about this in the book. I thought about it, but I didn't, because it might have framed me as unfeeling or harsh, but let me explain. So when I do funerals, when I officiate at funerals, I write out my eulogies. I don't just get up there and speak from bullet points. I write out every word because I believe in the rhythm and the poetry of the language, not just the story I'm trying to convey. And after a funeral, especially during COVID, I go right home. There's nowhere else to go. And the eulogy is on the passenger seat of my car. And I take it and I go in the house and I throw it in the garbage. I have an electronic copy, obviously, on my hard drive, but I throw it away. And as cold or callous as that may sound, I do it because it is a very stark reminder to me to enjoy my life. Because you know where our story ends up? In the garbage. So, you know, I see the opposite as a very stark and important reminder that you really have to, as much as you possibly can, embrace and enjoy and squeeze the juice out of life, because we all end up on a page that eventually ends up in the trash. And I find that inspiring in a way, not depressing.
Those are beautiful words. It also makes me think of our legacies in a sense. I have a talk that I give where it's about how to succeed in medicine, and it has all these pearls and pitfalls and platitudes and such. And I show a picture of one of my mentors. And this guy was a very big figure in medicine, very big figure in geriatrics, legendary guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I showed this picture and I asked people in the audience to raise their hand and if they know who this is.
Yeah, and they don't, right?
No, after 10 years, unless you're Mozart,
that's right.
Nobody knows who you are. So that whole idea of living, in a sense, in the moment, but living for the legacy that you're going to give to your children, to the people who may not even know you, but through inheritance and through relationships will carry your sentiments, your values.
And look, I do talk in the book about thinking about our lives as the obligation to live as a good ancestor. We don't think of ourselves as ancestors, but we are, just not yet. And it's important to live your life as a good ancestor while you're alive. Now, the other thing that what you said calls to mind for me is I obviously spend a lot of time in cemeteries. And I am every time, even after all these years, I am every time struck by the almost complete uniformity of inscriptions on headstones in cemeteries. They almost all say exactly the same thing. Because when you have to distill a person's life down to 15 characters per line and 4 lines per headstone, you are engaged in an exercise, a very productive, I think, exercise of essentialism, right? What really matters? And you look at headstones and they all say the same thing, with rare exception. Loving husband, father, grandfather, friend. Loving wife, mother, grandmother, friend. Not your resume, not your title, not your zip code, not your grandchild's GPA, none of it. Not your net worth. None of it makes those 15 characters per line and 4 lines. It's all about that inner circle of human relationship and love that we call our own family. That's it. I actually think COVID has helped remind us of that in a very important way. And I've, again, the same reason that I am moved by putting a eulogy in the trash, I'm moved by the uniformity of headstones in the cemetery. It's a very powerful reminder that it's who, not what we have, that matters. And that's one of the most beautiful lessons death comes to teach us. It's who, not what, that matters.
So one of the things that in reading the book, you describe in great detail, and I found a lot of resonance in my own life, is that we are both the sons of imperfect fathers. And you talk about a lot about your father's imperfections. My father had many, many imperfections, and we were barely on speaking terms at the time he passed.
Mm.
You know, as a rabbi, you know, and after people die, you know, love to hear your thoughts about how you resolve or how you deal with or how you carry through the years an imperfect parent.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to start by being honest about the duality of memory. And this is something I learned in my journey with my father through his Alzheimer's. It was a few years ago, Time magazine, Time did a special edition on the science of Alzheimer's. And they asked me to write a piece for it. And then they did one on the science of memory, and they asked me to write a piece for it. And what I wrote about in that essay is the duality of memory. The truth about memory is that it's very beautiful and it really hurts. It's both. And, you know, in the book, I say that it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time. And that is the dichotomous tension. That is the conflict when we live with, and die with, and bury a deeply flawed parent. Now, what I'm going to say to you is perhaps sounds paradoxical, but I hope it's helpful to you and others. This cognitive dissonance that we feel toward our highly imperfect parents is unresolvable. It is irreconcilable. Making peace with what cannot be resolved is a resolution. That's how I see it. For you to be able, where you are in your life now, Dave, to say, my father was profoundly imperfect, and I accept that. He was wonderful and terrible. Or he had good aspects and terrible aspects. And these are irreconcilable. And I will never be able to reconcile it. And I'm gonna live with that truth. That is its own resolution. And that's where I came to with my father. That he was a terrible father and an incredible father. And the other thing I think that, and by the way, I also think one of the positive things about memory and time is it does round some of the sharper edges. It does. You know, it takes a little bit of the sting out. And, you know, I think that ultimately it comes down to being truthful and honest about this cognitive dissonance, which I believe we all have in relation to our parents. And sometimes people come to see me. Now, here's where the religious perspective is sometimes helpful to people. Many times over the years, people have come to see me about their conflicted feelings in relationship with their parents. And they'll sit on the couch in my office that I call the couch of tears. And they will say, but doesn't the Torah say, isn't it in the 10 Commandments that I'm supposed to love my father and my mother? To which I reply, that's not what it says. It says you are supposed to honor your father and your mother. You cannot legislate love. You cannot love everything about them. You may not even be able to love most things about them, but you can lead an honorable life that never brings shame to your family. And that is how you can honor a terribly dysfunctional or flawed parent. And that you've done. Dave, I don't know you well, but I know you well enough to know you have led an honorable life. And that's the most one can do when living in the aftermath of the death of a deeply flawed parent. And by the way, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Well, it's interesting. Uh, Relatively speaking, your loss is recent.
Mm-hmm.
My father died 33 years ago. I was still kind of a young man at the time. And at the time, I had a lot of anger, and it was very difficult for me to say a lot of nice things about him.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I have noticed is now when I speak about him, it's almost always in the context of saying something that he said that was wise.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still all this objective memories of things that he did that just, they were not nice things. But I don't bring them up. They don't float up in my memory. What has remained are the things, and maybe there are not that many of them, but they were things of wisdom that he gave me. So time actually, I think, does help a bit.
It softens it rounds those sharp edges, and
Mhm.
and your father's death is a lesson to you, I think, is a challenge to you. Let me put it that way. A challenge to you to embrace the beauty of what remains. That is exactly why I titled the book as I did, because there is always beauty that remains, no matter how searing the loss, how dysfunctional the relationship. And you have found it. And I would imagine it has ennobled you in some way. And that wisdom is now yours. And that's the beautiful part. And we cannot deny the painful part. And that's this tension, of course.
So I'm going to ask one other question we both can answer, and then I'll turn it over to Vicki to moderate the question and answers. We're both getting older. We're the alta cockers of our profession.
Yeah.
What do you see in the new generation of rabbis? It's different, that is.
This is a hard question. I'm just going to be honest, because this is an important conversation we're having. I'm in a field where I personally feel there's less and less real talent in each generation. I think the level of talent of really talented people who are choosing to become rabbis and clergy, and my Christian friends say the seminaries there are in worse shape than the Jewish seminaries. So I think this is a societal issue. Smart young Jewish kids don't want to work 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week. They don't want to work weekends. They want to run hedge funds or make movies or, do whatever it is they do and have more free time. It's an extraordinarily demanding profession if you're going to take it seriously. So I think what we're probably going to see is maybe like in medicine, more rabbis doing less work. I think the big synagogues will have 8 or 10 rabbis, but none of them will really be the senior rabbi who will be really carrying the institution and the staff. I think you're going to see more and more co-senior rabbis. You're going to see more and more team approaches. And I know this is happening in medicine too, with hospitalists, et cetera. So I think you're going to start to see more and more specialization. I also think in the Jewish world, we're going to see more and more consolidation. I think very small synagogues just are not going to be economically viable going forward. And you're going to see more and more. We're merging with another synagogue in West Los Angeles. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. But And I'm not necessarily talking about a lack of a work ethic, but really a rejection of a lifestyle. I think it's more the latter. It's not so much that these kids are lazy and don't want to do their work, but they don't want the kind of lifestyle that my job really, really does require if you're going to take it seriously and do it as well as you can. What's same situation?
Yeah, you could almost do a search and replace there. I think that the upcoming generation of doctors is really smart. In fact, I think they're smarter than I am. I'm not sure that I would have been able to get into medical school if I were applying now. But they approach their work differently. And I'm not going to say they're not committed, because they really are. But just the same things you were saying about lifestyle is very different. And as you mentioned, the hospitalists by leaps and bounds are the fastest growing specialty in medicine. And it's because of really very circumscribed hours.
Right.
When
Right.
you're on, you're on. When you're off, you're off.
Yeah.
And that being available, whenever we were talking about you getting those calls after 10 o'clock at night, it's never good news.
Right.
But it's different. And I think people in our generation, what makes my work so meaningful, getting back to your original meaningful, is these relationships.
Right.
These relationships that I've carried, people like Vicki Goodman for decades now. And these are people who I helped them through a very difficult time of their lives. And they're grateful, and I am grateful to them.
Yeah, I agree. That's how I really get paid in relationships. And for me, to be in the same place, I am the only graduate of my class of rabbis, 1987, the only one, there were 70 of us, who is still at the same synagogue where he started. And for me, that's beautiful. I'm marrying, children of people I married. I'm doing bar mitzvahs for people whose parents I married, and I named them when they were babies, and I buried their grandparents or their great grandparents. And I find that beautiful, and I think so do the members of the congregation. But I think that's going to be a thing of the past. I really do. And there's a loss in that. I am never off, never, unless I'm out of the city. I never have the luxury of ignoring a call. And I don't suppose you do much either. And that is definitely changing. But listen to us, we sound like two old guys.
Vicki, it's back to you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both for the gift of this conversation. I know it's going back to the title, this conversation will remain with all of us who have had the privilege of hearing you both speak. And thank you. And Rabbi, thank you for the gift of your book.
Thank you.
I read it this weekend, and I was so moved and found so much meaning in your wise words of wisdom.
Thank you, Vicki.
It really, it's an eye-opening book. And I found myself thinking about my parents and about my grandparents and things that I hadn't actively thought about before. So thank you very much for writing it and for gifting it to all of us. We have quite a few questions here, clearly by some people that read your book. One of the questions, and I actually am curious about it too, you talked about an ethical will in the book.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could explain a little bit about that to our audience.
Yeah. So most people, but when they reach a certain age, have an estate plan and they have a will. And that will bequeaths their material assets to the loved ones they'll be leaving behind. Almost everyone has one. If everyone on this Zoom could raise their hands who have one, I'll bet you we'd be in the 90 to 95 percentile range. Since the Middle Ages, since really about the 11th century, beginning in Germany and Italy and France, Jews have been creating as individuals a parallel document called an ethical will, which articulates and ideally bequeaths our non-material legacy to our children and grandchildren and family and friends. In other words, the values we want to bequeath to our loved ones. And I have written mine and I published it in the book. It's the first time it's ever been, public in any way. And I think it's an extremely important and very powerful thing to create for your family. And by the way, Vicki, it takes most people just 20 or 30 minutes, because all you have to do is say, "Dear," and put in your children's names, "Dear Aaron and Hannah, when I am gone," and then I promise you, it just pours out of your heart. And if you don't have children, you leave it to your niece, to your nephew, to your best friend, to your siblings. We all have people we love who we hope will carry on our real legacy, our moral, ethical legacy, our values when we're gone. And this is the opportunity. And in our case, I have bound it with our estate plan so that it's almost like one document. And it's a really beautiful thing to do for your children. And, Dave mentioned earlier, that people don't always, he mentioned this 103-year-old actress, and her son knew that she didn't want that. So the ethical will is part of it, but we all should be planning, because, everyone says they want to die at home, but 80% of Americans don't die at home. And saying to your kids, "If that ever happens to me, just shoot me," that's not a plan. That's not a plan for how to handle your end of life decisions when you can't make them for yourself. So this is all under the rubric of let's not be in denial about death. Let's use death to make our lives more meaningful and to make our descendants' lives more meaningful as well. And the ethical will is a big part of that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It's something that I personally know I had not heard about, and I think it's very, very important.
To do it.
Yes, absolutely. Here is a question for both of you, and goes back to one of the comments, Rabbi Leder, that you made. If you're going to go through hell, you better have something good to show for it. Can you talk a little bit, both of you, about 2020 and what you feel it's revealed, and what are the positive things that what's the beauty that has remained?
You want to go first, Dave?
Sure. I think 2020, for many reasons, but mostly COVID, is going to change us as a society. It's going to change how we operate, how we do business. Perhaps the only real blessing of the pandemic is the freeways in Los Angeles are a lot better. And that may actually persist as people will be able to commute differently. I also think it reminds us, if we were getting a bit cocky, of what we're going through, but think about what was happening in World War II and in Europe. I think about us going through this terrible pandemic, but it's nothing compared to what was going on then. So it makes us take stock, but I'm also really grateful. I every day when I come into work, I have to fill out this questionnaire, online questionnaire. It lets me know whether I can come into work or not. And it's 7 or 8 questions, and it asks me about these symptoms. And I used to get really annoyed by it. And now I do it, and I say, I'm so grateful that I don't have these symptoms. And so much of what we've been taken for granted, right now, those of us have something to be grateful and thankful for. It's much, much more present.
Yeah, I think that's a universally true. This is the great opportunity of our lives to count our blessings. It's very hard to be depressed if you're grateful. Everything is better if you're grateful. And this is, of all times in our lives, this is the moment, which is what you're doing when the answer to those 7 questions is no.
Yeah.
This is the time to really learn about counting our blessings. I can tell you that I'm not going to make myself crazy on the freeways again, trying to get to a meeting with 4 or 5 people that I could just as easily Zoom with. I'm not interested in wearing uncomfortable clothing any longer. I am going to ask myself long and hard questions before I decide to give up a night at home. I used to give up 5 or 6 a week. And you know, I also think, and I know I said this earlier, but I don't think it can be said enough. One of the things, the thing perhaps the pandemic has taught us, and that death teaches us, is that no matter how many times we say, I love you, and no matter how many times we hug and hold and are hugged and held by the people we love, it's never enough. It's never enough. And if that is what we come out of this pandemic with, then we will not have come out of this hell empty-handed. And that's what I meant.
Thank you. So beautiful. I think that you have both helped us be more grateful for things like this conversation that we are privileged to listen to. You're both so wise, and thank you both for taking the time from your busy schedules to educate our audience, inspire them, move them, and leave them with this beautiful gift. I'm so grateful to both of you. You've both shared your time with us, 3 separate open mind programs, and we all love you, and we thank you. In the words of Rabbi Leder, I want to wish everyone a good and meaningful new year. Other wise words we've learned from you. Thank you both. Thank you to everybody that has tuned in today. I hope you'll join us for future Open Mind programs. Our next one is on January 19th. We'll be screening the film Bedlam, the documentary film Bedlam, and we have a fascinating panel of discussants. The new Los Angeles District Attorney, George Gascon, will be with us, the Honorable Patrick Kennedy, Jonathan Sharon from the Director of the Department of Mental Health. So I hope that you will all tune in and join us again on January 19th, 5 p.m. Pacific Coast time. And thank you both so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Wendy. Beautifully, beautifully done today. Thank you.
Thank you.